On the 20th of April, 1942, Adolf Hitler stood at a rail siding near his Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia and watched two prototype tanks struggle to drive 11 kilometers without breaking down, and 3 years later, the tank he chose that day to obsess over would help bankrupt the very production system Germany needed to win the war. This is the story of the Tiger, the heaviest, most feared, and most misunderstood tank of the Second World War. At the center of that story is not an engineer and not a general, but Adolf Hitler himself, a man who treated a tank program as a personal project, who played two rival companies against each other for his own birthday demonstration, and whose obsession with bigger guns and thicker armor pulled German industry in a direction that some of his own generals believed cost them the war. 55 minutes from now, you're going to understand this tank in a way most documentaries never bother to explain. We'll trace where the idea actually came from, why Hitler chose the design he chose, what that tank could actually do on a battlefield, how it actually died most of the time, and why the historians who study this most closely now describe it as a tactical success and a strategic failure at the same time. By the end, the Tiger stops looking like a legend and starts looking like exactly what it was, the product of one man's decisions, made in committee rooms, at birthday parties, and in panicked late-night factory shifts, each one traceable, each one documented. The Tiger didn't begin as Hitler's idea. January 1937 is where the story actually starts, when a German government office called WWII 6, the Army Weapons Department's Tank Design Bureau, asked the Henschel Company to design a 30-ton armored chassis. Heinrich Niepkamp ran that office, and over the course of 1937 the project changed names 3 times, first the Begleitwagen, then the Infanteriewagen, and finally, by April of that year, the Durchbruchswagen. The breakthrough vehicle. Even that name tells you what German planners had in mind at the time, not a tank built to defend a line, but one built to smash through it. For 4 years, the breakthrough vehicle stayed exactly that, a paper project alongside a pair of mild steel test hulls, the DWWII and DWWII, evolving slowly into something called the VK30.01 and then the heavier VK36.01. Nobody in Berlin was in a hurry, because Germany had Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, and at the start of the war those tanks were winning. There was no urgent military case for a 60-ton monster yet. That case had to be created, and it was created by an enemy nobody in the German high command had taken seriously enough. Then came the 22nd of June, 1941, when 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory under Directive 21, and within weeks German tank crews ran into something they hadn't planned for at all, the Soviet T-34 and the KV-1, tanks whose sloped armor and heavy guns outclassed anything in the German arsenal at the time. Standard German anti-tank guns simply bounced off Soviet armor that nobody in Berlin had accurately modeled before the invasion began. Henschel's own chief designer, Erwin Itters, later described the mood inside the company in blunt terms, recalling that there was great consternation when it was discovered that the Soviet tanks were superior to anything available to the German army. That consternation reached Hitler faster than you might expect from a wartime bureaucracy. On the 26th of May, 1941, before Barbarossa had even started, in a decision that shows Hitler was already anticipating a Soviet armor threat before his own troops had crossed the border, he personally ordered a 45-ton heavy tank, carrying the powerful 88mm gun, with frontal armor strong enough to stop almost anything fired back at it and capable of penetrating 100mm of armor at 1,500 meters. This wasn't a request passed down through layers of military bureaucracy. It was a direct order from the head of state. Specifying weight, gun caliber, and armor thickness in the same breath, and he wanted prototypes ready for a very specific date, his own 53rd birthday, the 20th of April, 1942. That deadline, a dictator's birthday, is the detail almost nobody puts at the center of this story, but it should be. What happened in the 11 months between that order and that birthday tells you almost everything about how Hitler actually ran Germany's tank program, not through quiet bureaucratic oversight or a calm engineering review process, but through personal demonstrations, personal favorites, and personal deadlines that had as much to do with one man's ego as with any coherent military-industrial strategy. 2 companies took up Hitler's challenge. Henschel went first, working under chief designer Erwin Itters and building on the Durchbruchswagen lineage already developed inside the company over the previous 4 years. Porsche came second, run by Ferdinand Porsche, a man who wasn't merely a competing engineer but a personal acquaintance of the Führer, with access to the center of German political power that Henschel simply didn't have. This is where the story stops being about tanks and starts being about access. Since September 1939, Ferdinand Porsche had chaired the German Panzer Commission, a position that put him at the center of German tank policy discussions for nearly 2 years before this specific competition even began, and through 1941 and 1942 he met with Hitler repeatedly to discuss the very project he was now competing for. Henschel built tanks. Porsche, by 1941, had a direct line to the man who would decide which tank Germany actually built, and as you're about to see, that line mattered more than the engineering did, at least for a while. There's a modern parallel here that has nothing to do with tanks at all. In any large procurement process, corporate or military, then or now, the bidder with informal access to the final decision maker often gets treated differently than the data alone would justify, and a vendor who can get 15 minutes in front of the person actually signing the contract has an advantage no spreadsheet of specifications can fully offset. Porsche didn't need the better design. He needed the better relationship, and for a while, that's exactly what he had. Krupp, the steel and armaments firm based in Essen, built an identical turret design for both competing chassis, which meant the entire competition came down to what was happening underneath that shared turret, the hull, the suspension, and most importantly, the drivetrain. Henschel built a conventional design with a standard mechanical transmission, the kind German tank crews already knew how to maintain and repair in the field. Porsche, true to form, went radical instead, building a petrol-electric drivetrain in which the engine didn't turn the tracks directly through gears but drove electrical generators, which in turn powered electric motors connected to each track. On paper, it was an elegant answer to some of the mechanical challenges of moving a 45-ton vehicle. It was also a serious practical problem, and not for any reason related to engineering elegance. Copper was the issue, and in 1941 and 1942 copper was one of the most contested raw materials in the entire German war machine, needed in enormous quantities for the electrical systems running Germany's U-boat fleet, among countless other military priorities. The Porsche electric drivetrain demanded large quantities of that same scarce metal. Germany was already short on raw materials by this point in the war, which meant Porsche had effectively designed a tank that, if built at scale, would have competed directly with the Navy's submarine program for the same limited supply. A second problem sat underneath the copper issue, one that would prove impossible to ignore once both prototypes were tested side by side. The petrol-electric system, clever as it looked on paper, made the tank harder to maneuver than Henschel's simpler mechanical alternative. In a design review, that weakness might have stayed buried in a footnote. On a test track, in front of the men who would actually decide which tank went to war, it was about to become impossible to hide. Here's what actually happened on the 20th of April, 1942, the day Hitler turned 53, and the single event that reveals, more clearly than any other in this story, exactly how personally invested he was in this tank. The deadline nearly broke the Henschel team. Engineers worked around the clock through the final days of preparation, and the first prototype's hull and turret weren't even mated together until the 15th of April, 5 days before the demonstration was set to take place in front of the head of state. Engineer Kurt Arnold and his team finished the vehicle on the 17th with, by their own account, 40 minutes to spare before it had to be loaded onto a train for the journey east to Rassenburg. 40 minutes, on a tank that was about to be presented as a war-winning weapon to the single most powerful man in Germany. Both prototypes, the Henschel and the Porsche, were unloaded near Hitler's Wolfslair headquarters and driven roughly 11 kilometers to the actual demonstration site, and both broke down more than once on that short drive. These weren't finished, reliable war machines rolling confidently into a showcase. They were rushed prototypes, built under emergency deadline pressure, for one specific audience of one specific man, on one specific date that had nothing to do with battlefield readiness and everything to do with the calendar. And when that audience finally arrived, Hitler did something that tells you exactly where his attention actually was. He spent roughly 30 minutes examining the Porsche tank, listening closely as Ferdinand Porsche and his engineers walked him through the design, the electric drivetrain, and its theoretical advantages. Then he turned to the Henschel prototype, the tank that would, within months, actually win the production contract and go on to fight across 3 continents, and gave it 2 to 3 minutes. 2 to 3 minutes against 30. That ratio isn't a detail most historians put front and center, but it might be the single clearest piece of evidence we have for how Hitler's personal preference operated before any committee had met, before any production order had been signed, before a single shot had been fired on any battlefield. He'd effectively already decided which engineer he liked best, and it wasn't the one whose tank was about to win. Ferdinand Porsche walked away from that demonstration with the Cross of Military Merit, First Class, pinned to his chest. Henschel walked away with no medal at all, and, as it turned out, the actual production contract. Because in the maneuverability trials that followed, conducted in front of Hermann Göring and armaments official Albert Speer, the Henschel team, fully aware of where the Porsche design was structurally weak, proposed a specific test, a turning trial. The Henschel prototype spun in place, demonstrating tight, confident control, while the Porsche prototype struggled to complete even a 90-degree turn. On pure, observable performance, in front of two of the most senior men in the German war machine, Henschel had won decisively, and everyone present watched it happen in real time. Hitler's response wasn't to cancel the Porsche project on the spot. Instead, he ordered Ferdinand Porsche to build 100 production hulls anyway, despite having just watched, with his own eyes, the Henschel tank prove faster, more maneuverable, and more reliable, and despite knowing the Porsche design would compete directly with German U-boat production for scarce copper. Adolf Hitler had just watched objective proof, in person, that one design was clearly better, and he chose to keep funding the other one regardless. It's worth sitting with how unusual that decision actually was, even by the standards of wartime improvisation. This wasn't a case of incomplete information, where Hitler simply didn't know which tank performed better. He watched the test. He saw the result. And he still chose, in that exact moment, to keep backing the design that had just visibly lost, a decision that makes far more sense as personal loyalty to a man he liked than as a rational allocation of Germany's increasingly scarce wartime industrial capacity. It took 4 more months, and 1 more demonstration, for engineering reality to finally override personal favor. Albert Speer himself drove the Porsche prototype at the Nibelungenwerk plant in August 1942 and came away condemning it outright, and even then, it was Speer's own direct, personal intervention that finally tipped the balance against Porsche, not a routine procurement review and not a quiet memo working its way up through the bureaucracy. The Porsche project was formally cancelled in November 1942, after one final round of trials at a location called Bad Berka, more than half a year after Hitler had already seen the design underperform with his own eyes. By then, though, Ferdinand Porsche had a problem of his own making. Confident of victory from the very start, on the strength of his relationship with Hitler rather than the strength of his design, he had already pre-built around 100 chassis in anticipation of winning the contract, and that meant they couldn't simply be scrapped once too much material and labor had already gone into them. Roughly 91 of those chassis got converted into something else entirely, a heavy tank destroyer originally called the Ferdinand and later renamed the Elephant, mounting a long 88mm Pak 43-2 gun. 89 of these elephants would go on to fight at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, supporting the northern German attack, a footnote to the Tiger story in most accounts, but a direct, traceable consequence of Hitler's birthday favoritism 18 months earlier. There's an odd inheritance hiding in that fact, and it has nothing to do with tanks specifically. The Tiger program's most expensive failure didn't simply vanish when it lost the competition. It got repurposed into something adjacent instead, the same way failed projects inside large organizations often get quietly reassigned to a different department rather than cancelled outright, because too much money and prestige has already gone in to admit the mistake cleanly. 91 chassis, built on nothing more than one man's confidence in his relationship with Hitler, ended up fighting an entirely different kind of war than the one they were originally designed for. Henschel's version entered full production not long after, and it became exactly what Hitler had pushed it to become through that entire favoritism-driven process. The Tiger I, formerly the Panzerkampfwagen 6 and later renamed by Hitler's own personal order on the 27th of February, 1944, to Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Aus. Weighed approximately 57 tons and carried a crew of 5, a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a radio operator who doubled as a hull machine gunner. 5 men, 57 tons of steel. Its main weapon, the 8.8 cm KWK-36 gun, came directly from the famous 88 mm anti-aircraft gun that had already proven, in earlier campaigns, that it could punch through armor other German guns couldn't touch. Frontal hull and turret armor measured 100 mm, and the gun mantlet ran as thick as 110 to 200 mm depending on exactly where a shell struck it, though critically, none of this armor was sloped. It was flat, vertical steel, brute thickness as the design philosophy rather than the clever angled geometry that let other tanks of the era do more with less material. A Maybach engine provided the power, the HL-210 on the earliest production tanks and later the upgraded HL-230. Top speed reached around 45 km per hour on a good road, though German command eventually capped operational speed closer to 38 km per hour, specifically to reduce mechanical strain on a vehicle that was already proving difficult to keep running. Underneath the hull sat an unusual and distinctive suspension system, interleaved, overlapping road wheels mounted on torsion bars, a design the Germans called Schachtel-Laufwerk. The smoother ride and better weight distribution this gave the tank came at a hidden cost that would haunt crews on the Eastern Front specifically, something we'll get to later in this video. Production began in August 1942, with the first Tiger I rolling off the Henschel line on the 4th of that month, and continued until August 1944, almost exactly 2 years of continuous manufacturing. Total output across that period reached 1,347 units, according to historian Thomas Jens's research, which draws directly on original German wartime production records, though other sources, including a 1994 article in World War II magazine, cite a slightly different figure of 1,355. Compare either number to the simpler Panzer IV, which Germany built in the thousands across that same war. The Tiger was never going to be a mass-produced tank, by design, by cost, and by sheer manufacturing complexity, and as this video explores in detail later, that scarcity may be the single most important fact about this tank, more important than any individual battlefield engagement it ever fought. And it was extraordinarily expensive to build, by any measure historians have managed to reconstruct. A single Tiger I ran to roughly 290,375 Reichsmarks according to Jens's figures, though other contemporary sources cite a slightly lower 250,800 Reichsmarks, a number that excludes weapons and radios fitted afterward. Either way, that places one Tiger somewhere between 2.8 and 3.5 times the cost of a single Panzer IV. A wartime crew manual called the Tigerfibel, published in August 1943 specifically to instill pride and care in Tiger crews, claimed an even more dramatic figure, 800,000 Reichsmarks and 300,000 man-hours per tank. Historian Bruce Newsom argues that figure was inflated by around 55% for propaganda purposes, since the Tigerfibel wanted German crews to feel they were driving something irreplaceable and precious, worth protecting at almost any cost, rather than just another piece of military hardware. Historian Stephen Zaloga points instead to a December 1942 export price quoted to Japan, around 645,000 Reichsmarks, as a more reliable independent estimate of true cost. No single number here commands universal agreement among historians, and this video won't pretend otherwise, but every version of it confirms the same underlying point: this was, by a wide margin, the most expensive tank Germany built during the entire war. Kassel is where the Tiger actually came together, at the Henschel and Sohn works, with turrets and the 88 mm guns supplied separately by Krupp and Essen, and turret assembly also handled in part by a firm called Wegmann. Henschel built the entirety of Germany's Tiger output. All 1,828 Tiger I and Tiger II tanks combined came from that single company's plant, with tank manufacturing making up roughly a third of everything the factory produced during the war, alongside its other wartime production lines. Forced labor sustained that production in a well-documented way that the history books don't shy away from. Records show approximately 6,000 forced laborers working at Henschel across the war, and by 1945 the plant was running roughly 8,000 workers across two 12-hour shifts, out of a peak wartime workforce that reached around 24,000 in October 1943. A subcamp of Dachau concentration camp supplied forced labor directly to Henschel's production lines, which means the tank Hitler personally championed at his own birthday party was, within a few years, being built in part by people held in a system connected directly to Dachau. Allied prisoners of war from a camp called Stalag 9A were used in the factory too, a direct violation of the Geneva Conventions governing the treatment of captured enemy soldiers. None of this is a side note to bolt onto an engineering story for the sake of completeness. The Tiger's reputation. As a feat of engineering, and the conditions under which it was actually built at the pace Hitler demanded are part of the same continuous history, and a documentary about Hitler's personal involvement in this tank can't responsibly pull his obsession with the machine apart from the human cost of producing it on his timeline. The Tiger's combat debut was a failure, and Hitler personally ordered that failure against the better judgment of his own commanders, less than 5 months after his birthday demonstration. Near Leningrad, in swampy, heavily forested terrain around a place called Nga, the first Tigers went into combat on the 23rd of September, 1942. Heinz Guderian, who would become Inspector General of Armored Troops the following March and would go on to become one of the most consistent internal critics of Hitler's tank decisions, later described exactly what went wrong in that first engagement, and he placed the blame squarely on Hitler's personal decision-making rather than on any failure of the tank itself. Hitler, in Guderian's account, ordered that the Tigers be committed in a quite secondary operation, in a limited attack carried out in terrain that was utterly unsuitable, since in the swampy forest near Leningrad heavy tanks could only move in single file along the forest tracks, exactly where Soviet anti-tank guns were already positioned and waiting for them. The results, in Guderian's own words, were not only heavy, unnecessary casualties, but also the loss of secrecy and of the element of surprise for future operations. One Tiger got stuck in that swampy terrain during the engagement and had to be abandoned outright. Germany's single most expensive tank, lost not to enemy fire in some dramatic climactic battle but to mud, on its very first day in combat, because the man giving the order wanted a dramatic debut on his own schedule more than he wanted a sound tactical decision built around terrain his own commanders understood far better than he did. What this tells us about Hitler's relationship to this weapon, this early in its operational life, is worth pausing on. He'd spent 11 months personally shepherding this tank from a birthday demonstration to a finished production order, and the very first time he had the opportunity to actually use it, he overruled basic battlefield logic to force a premature debut, sacrificing secrecy and tactical advantage for the sake of getting his new weapon into action on a schedule that served his own sense of urgency rather than any genuine military necessity. Tigers saw their second combat deployment roughly 2 months later, on the 1st of December, 1942, this time far to the south in Tunisia, fighting east of a town called Tiburba, part of Germany's North African campaign, by then already increasingly desperate for any technological advantage it could find against growing Allied strength in the region. A single Tiger, disabled near a position called Point 174 and also referred to in some accounts as Giryat El Attach, was captured by British forces on the 24th of April, 1943, during an operation called Vulcan in Tunisia. That tank, known today by its German turret number, Tiger 131, would go on to become the single most important surviving artifact of this entire story, and the documentary returns to it at the end, because in September 2025, just months before this video was made, museum staff doing routine maintenance on that exact tank found a piece of battle shrapnel wedged in one of its wheels. 82 years after it was knocked out of action on a Tunisian hillside, it's still revealing new physical evidence of the day it stopped fighting. These weren't novices stumbling onto an easy prize. Tiger 131 had been disabled in active combat, inspected afterward by both Winston Churchill and King George VI, a detail that itself tells you how much attention this single captured tank received, even from the very top of the British political and royal establishment, and eventually shipped back to Britain, where, decades later, it would become the only running Tiger I tank left in the entire world. Exactly how that happened comes later in this video. Kursk is the battle most people associate with the Tiger more than any other, fought between the 5th and 16th of July, 1943, and this is exactly where the popular history of the Tiger and the actual verified historical record start to diverge sharply enough that getting this section right matters more than almost anything else in this script. Hundreds of Tiger tanks smashing into Soviet lines, with a legendary tank battle at a village called Prokhorovka destroying dozens of Tigers in a single day of close-range combat. That's the version most people have heard, repeated in documentaries, books, and online videos for decades, often without anyone going back to check it against the primary archival record. Here's what the verified record actually shows instead. Germany deployed 146 Tigers at Kursk, a real and meaningful number but far smaller than popular imagination usually suggests, especially across a battle that involved many thousands of tanks on both sides combined. And the specific, famous claim that the Soviets destroyed 70, or in some versions a full 100, Tiger tanks at Prokhorovka alone in a single day simply doesn't hold up against the documentary record. 53 Tiger kills across the period from the 12th through the 24th of July is what the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army's own internal report from September 1943 actually claimed, already a smaller and more specific number than the popular legend. And that figure was inflated even further after the war for propaganda purposes as the story of Prokhorovka grew into Soviet national mythology. The most rigorous recent answer to this question comes from historian Ben Wheatley's 2024 peer-reviewed research, published in the Journal of Slavic Military Studies, which went back to original German Army High Command loss and damage reports rather than relying on Soviet wartime claims or post-war German memoirs written by men with their own reputations to protect. What Wheatley's research confirms is at least one total Tiger loss specifically at Prokhorovka, a finding that overturns two competing myths simultaneously. It overturns the old, heavily inflated Soviet narrative of dozens of Tigers destroyed in a single engagement, but it also overturns a more recent revisionist claim, popular in some corners of online tank history enthusiasm, that 0 Tigers were lost at Prokhorovka at all. The verified truth sits between two competing exaggerations, and it took until 2024, 81 years after the battle itself, for rigorous archival research to actually pin that truth down with confidence. Only around 6 of the 146 Tigers deployed at Kursk were actually destroyed across the full campaign, by one broader estimate, and historian David Glantz, writing with Jonathan House, puts total German tank losses across the entire Kursk campaign at around 323 tanks destroyed, against well over 1,600 Soviet tanks lost in the same fighting. The Tigers' role at Kursk was real, and it mattered tactically, but it amounted to a small number of tanks operating inside an enormous battle, not the tank versus tank showdown the popular imagination has built around it over 8 decades of retelling. Villers-Bocage is the engagement people remember as one man's story when it was actually a company's story, and the gap between those two versions tells you almost as much about wartime propaganda as it does about the tank itself, in the same way Kursk gets remembered wrong. A week after the Normandy landings, on the 13th of June, 1944, a German tank commander named Michael Wittmann, commanding a single Tiger I, attacked a column of British vehicles from the 7th Armoured Division, the unit nicknamed the Desert Rats, near the town of Villers-Bocage. Wittmann's tank alone is credited with destroying up to 14 tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns in roughly 15 minutes, before his own Tiger was knocked out. Later that same day by British anti-tank fire, and he and his crew escaped the burning vehicle on foot. That's a genuinely extraordinary tactical achievement for one tank crew, by any standard, but it isn't the whole story of what happened at Villers-Bocage that day, and the gap between the full story and the famous version turns out to be one of the most revealing parts of this entire documentary. Wittmann's entire company, for additional Tiger tanks beyond his own, also engaged the British column that day, according to modern historical research including detailed analysis by historian John Buckley, and a large share of the total destruction credited to Wittmann personally was actually achieved by his company as a whole, working together, rather than by one man acting alone. German wartime propaganda, distributed through a magazine called Signal, used doctored composite photographs and coverage that credited the entire engagement to Wittmann individually, transforming a successful company action into a single celebrity's legend almost overnight. Buckley's blunt assessment of how this distortion has echoed forward across 8 decades is worth hearing directly. Many historians, through to today, continue to repackage unquestioningly Nazi propaganda, retelling the single hero version of Villers-Bocage without ever examining where that version actually came from. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because at its core it isn't really a story about tanks at all. It's a story about how a wartime propaganda machine, not unlike the way modern media narratives sometimes flatten a team effort into a single viral individual, crediting one face with the work of an entire group, took a genuinely impressive but collective achievement and rebuilt it around one telegenic commander, because one face is simply easier to put on a magazine cover than 5 separate tank crews working in coordination. Michael Wittmann didn't survive the war much longer after that engagement. He was killed on the 8th of August, 1944, less than 2 months after Villers-Bocage, and his crew's grave wasn't actually found until 1983, nearly 4 decades after his death, when they were reinterred at a German military cemetery at La Cam in Normandy, finally giving the men a permanent, identified resting place. Across his full combat career, Wittmann is credited with 138 kills, a real combat record in its own right that stands on its own, even once you fully account for the propaganda inflation surrounding his single most famous engagement. Wittmann wasn't actually the highest-scoring tank commander of the entire war, a title that belongs instead to a man with a far lower public profile, then and now. Kurt Nispel is credited with 168 confirmed kills, and as many as 195 once disputed claims get factored in, making him, by the numbers, the highest-scoring tank ace of the entire Second World War, on any side, in any nation's army. Nispel clashed repeatedly with Nazi Party authorities over the course of the war, unlike Wittmann, and he never received anything close to the propaganda treatment that turned Wittmann into a household name back in Germany. The algorithm of wartime fame, it turns out, was never simply a direct measurement of who actually destroyed the most enemy vehicles. Proximity to the propaganda apparatus mattered just as much as the kill count itself. Otto Carius, another Tiger commander, is credited with over 150 kills across his service, and he later wrote one of the most widely read first-hand accounts of Tiger combat to survive the war, a memoir called Tigers in the Mud. One detail in that memoir cuts directly against the tank's fearsome popular reputation. Carius described the Tiger as driving, in his own words, just like a car, not some unwieldy lumbering beast, but a vehicle that, when properly maintained and operated by a trained crew, handled with surprising normalcy. He also stated a clear, explicit preference for the Tiger I specifically over its larger successor, the Tiger II, a preference that matters a great deal once this video gets into that second tank's specific problems. Germany was already developing the Tiger's successor by 1943, while the Tiger I was still in full production, and the origin of that successor tells us, once again, exactly whose priorities were actually driving German tank design at the highest level of the entire war effort. The Tiger II, nicknamed the Königstiger, or King Tiger, stemmed directly from Hitler's desire to mount a longer-barreled, more powerful 88mm gun in a tank, according to the Tank Museum's own historical research. Not a committee decision reached through careful deliberation among engineers and frontline officers. Not a battlefield requirement identified by commanders who had actually fought against Allied armor and reported back specific operational needs. Hitler's desire, specifically and personally, for a bigger gun than the one his own signature tank already carried. The 8.8cm KWK-43 was the result, with a barrel measuring 6.24 meters, far longer than the Tiger I's gun, capable of penetrating over 200 millimeters of vertical armor at 1 kilometer's range and still over 170 millimeters at 2 kilometers. This weapon achieved roughly 100% accuracy against a 2x2.5 meter target at 1 kilometer in test conditions, and around 85% accuracy even out to 2 kilometers. By pure gunnery performance alone, this was an extraordinary weapon, arguably one of the most effective tank guns fielded by any nation during the entire war. But carrying it meant the rest of the tank had to grow by a wide margin. The Tiger II weighed approximately 70 tons, 13 tons heavier than the Tiger I before it, with frontal hull armor up to 150 mm thick and a production turret front of 180 mm, now properly sloped in the style borrowed directly from the Panther tank's more efficient armor geometry. Henschel's design, designated VK45.03, beat out a competing Porsche proposal, once again called VK45.02 or internally the TYP180, for the production contract, and history repeated itself in a narrow but unmistakable sense. Porsche competed, Porsche lost again, and the two finished tanks shared almost no parts in common beyond the engine, the pressed steel road wheels, and the commander's cupola. Here's the detail that should reframe how you think about the King Tiger entirely, more than any other single fact in this video. It used the exact same Maybach HL230 engine, producing roughly 700 horsepower, as the much lighter Tiger I and the considerably lighter Panther. Hitler had ordered a tank to carry a far more powerful gun and far thicker armor than its predecessor, but nobody scaled up the engine to actually match those new demands, and the result was a 70-ton vehicle running on an engine originally designed and proven for a 57-ton tank. This is the entire strategic critique of Hitler's tank obsession laid out in a single mechanical fact: bigger guns, thicker armor, greater prestige, without the supporting infrastructure of horsepower, fuel logistics, or production capacity actually being scaled up to make the bigger vehicle work reliably in the field, under combat conditions. This exact pattern shows up again and again across multiple tank programs, not just the Tiger, according to Albert Speer's own post-war memoir, Inside the Third Reich. The Tiger had originally been designed to weigh 50 tons, Speer wrote, but Hitler's demands pushed it up to 57 tons, and when Germany tried building a lighter, more agile 30-ton tank specifically to escape that weight creep problem, the Panther, Hitler once again insisted on clapping so much armor onto it, along with larger guns, that it ultimately reached 48 tons, nearly the original weight of the Tiger he had supposedly been trying to move away from in the first place. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment, according to Speer's own account. It was a recurring habit, repeated program after program, with Hitler asking for more armor, more gun, more weight, on every tank Germany developed, regardless of what his own engineers told him the supporting systems could actually handle in the field. January 1944 is when Tiger II production began, running until March 1945, just over a year of manufacturing compared to the Tiger II's roughly 2 years, and total output across that period reached 492 units, one built in 1943, 379 across the full year of 1944, and a final 112 completed in the opening months of 1945 before the war ended. Germany had originally ordered around 1,500 of these tanks but built less than a third of that number, largely because Allied bombing raids in September and October of 1944 destroyed approximately 95% of the Henschel plant's floor area across 5 separate bombing raids. An estimated 657 Tiger IIs were simply never built, because the one factory in all of Germany capable of building them had been flattened from the air before it could finish the order. The Tiger II's combat debut came on the 11th of July, 1944, in Normandy, fielded by the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, and it reached the Eastern Front roughly a month later, around the 12th of August, 1944, fighting on both fronts within weeks of each other. But the engagement that most clearly exposes everything wrong with Hitler's approach to this tank's design came 5 months later, in the Ardennes forest, in conditions that turned the Tiger II's core engineering flaw into a strategic catastrophe. A German armored task force commanded by Joachim Paper included Tiger II tanks as part of its advance through Belgian and Luxembourg terrain between the 16th and 25th of December, 1944, during what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Paper, by direct historical account, disliked the King Tiger specifically because of its enormous fuel consumption. Each tank burned through fuel at a rate of roughly 2 American gallons per mile, in terrain Paper himself reportedly described as more suitable for bicycles than for tanks. He made a deliberate tactical choice to place the King Tigers toward the rear of his column rather than at the front, where their firepower might have mattered most in the opening breakthrough, and his entire offensive depended on capturing American fuel depots simply to keep his armored force moving at all. At one point his forces seized approximately 50,000 U.S. gallons of captured fuel at a town called Bullingen, fuel that belonged to the very army he was attacking. It wasn't enough. Paper's force still ran dry before it could achieve its objectives, and 6 Tiger IIs were abandoned, completely out of fuel, by Paper's own retreating forces at a town called La Gleize. Germany's most powerful and most expensive tank sat immobilized there, not by enemy action, not by a hostile shell, not by a mine or an ambush, but by the exact same fuel consumption problem that Hitler's gun and armor obsession had built directly into the design from its very first specifications. This wasn't an isolated incident specific to one bad night in the Ardennes, either. A remarkably consistent picture emerges once you look at the broader pattern of how Tiger tanks were actually lost across the entire war, campaign by campaign, and that picture runs directly counter to the tank's popular reputation as a nearly indestructible battlefield monster. In Sicily, of 17 Tigers deployed during the Allied invasion, 16 were destroyed by their own crews or simply abandoned in the retreat, and not one was lost to direct enemy fire in that entire campaign. Not one. 64 Tigers were lost in total at the Battle of Cassino in the summer of 1943, and only 5 of those losses came from actual enemy fire, the remaining 59 were abandoned because repairs couldn't be completed quickly enough during German retreats under pressure. Of roughly 126 Tigers committed to the fighting in the Normandy campaign of 1944, only about 4 or 5 made it out of the entire campaign intact, and Allied air attacks, chronic fuel shortages, and a basic inability to recover and repair damaged tanks in time, rather than direct tank versus tank combat, were the dominant causes of loss throughout. Tiger IIs from the 103rd and 503rd SS battalions claimed approximately 500 enemy kills between January and April of 1945 in Hungary, an impressive combat record on paper, but Germany simultaneously lost 45 of its own Tiger IIs in that same campaign, and most of those 45 were blown up by their own crews after breaking down or running out of fuel, specifically and deliberately so the tanks couldn't be captured intact by advancing Soviet forces. 59%. That's how many of Germany's Tiger tanks were still operational on the 15th of March, 1945, mere weeks before the war's end, barely ahead of the supposedly less sophisticated Panzer IV at 62%, and well ahead of the more advanced Panther, which sat at just 48% operational readiness. The number shows just how chronic this underlying problem had become across the entire German Tiger fleet by that late stage of the war. The myth, repeated across decades of documentaries and books and online videos, says the Tiger was effectively invincible. The verified record shows something close to the opposite. Across multiple campaigns, spanning years of fighting on 3 continents, more Tigers were destroyed by their own crews, or simply left behind broken down and abandoned, than were ever knocked out by enemy tanks or anti-tank guns in direct combat. This brings us to the central question this entire video has been building toward, the question sitting underneath every fact covered so far, whether Adolf Hitler's personal fixation on the Tiger, on bigger guns, thicker armor, and more prestigious engineering, actually helped Germany win battles, or quietly undermine Germany's broader ability to win the war as a whole. The historians who study this question most closely tend to land on roughly the same answer, even when they disagree sharply about the finer details. Historian Steven Zaloga puts it about as plainly as it gets: the top 3 secrets to winning tank battles are quantity, quantity, quantity. More than 40,000 Sherman tanks rolled out of American factories during the war, and the Soviet Union built T-34s in numbers that dwarfed German heavy tank production by an entire order of magnitude. Germany, by stark contrast, built 1,347 Tiger IIs and 492 Tiger IIs combined across the entire conflict, fewer than 1,900 of Hitler's signature heavy tank in total, against tens of thousands of Allied tanks rolling continuously off assembly lines on the other side of the front line. A tactical success but strategic failure, for words, that's how the Tank Museum's own institutional verdict on the Tiger II sums up the contradiction sitting at the heart of this entire story. Individual Tiger crews, when properly trained and properly supplied with fuel and ammunition, could and did destroy disproportionate numbers of enemy tanks relative to their own numbers, and Zaloga himself notes that the mythology of the invincible Tiger tank exists in the first place because American soldiers fighting in Europe genuinely experienced it that way, tank for tank, in direct engagements where the Tiger's gun and armor gave it a real, measurable edge. But winning individual battles while simultaneously losing the underlying production war isn't, in any meaningful strategic sense, actually winning the war a tank was built to fight. And this critique wasn't only something historians constructed decades later with the benefit of hindsight, either. It was a live, documented argument happening inside the German high command while the war was still being fought. Heinz Guderian, the same man who'd already watched Hitler waste the Tiger's combat debut near Leningrad back in 1942, pushed back repeatedly against Hitler's priorities throughout the war, arguing instead for mass production of proven, simpler tank designs and for concentrating tank forces into larger formations rather than scattering small numbers of expensive, irreplaceable vehicles thinly across the entire front. Guderian also pointed specifically to the Panther's premature combat debut at Kursk in June 1943, a tank rushed into battle with around 45 identified mechanical faults still unresolved, as further evidence that Hitler's obsession with rushing impressive new designs into action on his own personal schedule was costing Germany more, in practical terms, than it was actually gaining on the battlefield. One important caution belongs here, in the interest of giving you the full and honest picture rather than a tidy one that flatters a single narrative. Guderian's own post-war memoir, Panzerleader, isn't a neutral historical source, and this video would be doing you a disservice if it treated it as one. Historian Russell Hart has specifically flagged the memoir as self-serving, a book that, like a great many German general memoirs written after 1945, tends to shift blame conveniently toward Hitler personally while simultaneously protecting the reputation of the officer corps as a whole, including Guderian's own role within it. That important caveat doesn't mean Guderian was factually wrong about the Tiger and the Panther specifically. The documented timeline of Hitler's birthday demonstration, his direct order to build Porsche hulls despite watching the Henschel tank prove clearly superior in testing, and Albert Speer's entirely independent account of escalating weight demands across multiple separate tank programs all corroborate the broader pattern Guderian describes in his memoir. What it does mean is that his specific framing of himself as the lone clear-eyed voice of military reason deserves a healthy dose of skepticism, even while the underlying, independently corroborated facts still hold up. Part of why the Tiger's reputation grew so far beyond its actual production numbers and its actual combat record comes down to a deliberate wartime information campaign on the German side, and part of it comes down to simple, understandable human psychology operating on the Allied side of the front line. The Tiger Fiebel crew manual's inflated cost and man-hour figures weren't accidental exaggerations. They were deliberately designed to make German tank crews feel they were operating something precious and irreplaceable, a weapon worth protecting and fighting for at almost any cost. Signal magazine's doctored, composite coverage of Michael Wittmann at Villers-Bocage transformed one company's genuinely impressive collective combat success into a single celebrity commander's legend, almost overnight, for an audience back home that needed heroes. And on the Allied side of the line, soldiers facing German armor frequently identified any large German tank they encountered in combat as a Tiger specifically, whether or not it actually was one, a phenomenon serious enough at the time that British commander Bernard Montgomery is reported to have actively discouraged this kind of imprecise battlefield reporting, specifically because of what some historians have come to call Tiger phobia, a psychological fear response among Allied troops that ran well ahead of the tank's actual numbers on any given battlefield. Deliberate German propaganda designed to inflate the Tiger's mystique, layered on top of Allied soldiers' understandable tendency to see Tigers everywhere they looked in the chaos of combat, that combination produced exactly the inflated legend we're still carefully unwinding 80 years later, a legend this video has tried, fact by fact and source by source, to separate cleanly from the verified historical record underneath it. The only running Tiger I tank in the entire world sits today at the Tank Museum in Bovington, England, Tiger 131, the very same tank captured during Operation Vulcan in Tunisia on the 24th of April, 1943, the tank personally inspected by both Winston Churchill and King George VI shortly after its capture on that Tunisian hillside. Transferred to the museum in 1951, it returned to genuine running order for the first time in decades after a full, painstaking restoration completed in 2012, and it even appeared on screen in the 2014 feature film Fury, the first time a genuinely running Tiger tank had appeared in any feature film since 1950. Roughly 220,000 visitors see it in person every single year, making it one of the most viewed surviving artifacts from this entire chapter of the war. A piece of battle shrapnel, wedged inside one of Tiger 131's wheels and undiscovered for over 8 decades, turned up during routine maintenance work in September 2025, just months before this video was actually produced. Nick Booth, the museum's head of curatorial services, described the discovery as both remarkable and sobering, a stark reminder, in his own words, of the history of this tank, and of the desperate conditions in which British soldiers fought it to a standstill on a Tunisian hillside in 1943. 82 years after it last fired a shot in anger, this single surviving Tiger is still, even now, giving up new physical evidence of the exact day its war finally ended. Only one running Tiger II survives anywhere in the world today, held at the Musée de Blindes in Saumur, France, still bearing its original wartime number, 300, from its service with the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion decades ago. The Tank Museum at Bovington holds a second Tiger II, the oldest surviving example of the type in existence anywhere, currently undergoing a £1 million restoration project specifically intended to return it to genuine running order as well, joining Tiger 131 as a working piece of this history rather than a static display. The Saumur Tiger II made its first ever journey to the United Kingdom in June 2025, at an event called Tankfest, transported nearly 400 miles by low-loaders specifically for the occasion, to run publicly alongside Tiger 131 for the first time. It marked the first time a Tiger I and a Tiger II had run together in public anywhere in the world in 80 years, two machines that Adolf Hitler personally pushed into existence, born out of his own birthday demonstrations and his own repeated demands for bigger guns and thicker armor, sharing the same patch of English grass that, 80 years earlier, his army had been fighting with everything it had to keep out of Allied hands entirely. Strip away 80 years of propaganda, post-war memoir scorsettling, and accumulated battlefield mythology, and here's what the verified record actually shows. The Tiger was a genuinely formidable tank in individual combat, built by some of Germany's most capable engineers and fought by some of the most skilled and battle-hardened tank crews of the entire war. It was also a tank whose entire existence, from the birthday deadline that rushed its very first prototype into existence, to the personal favoritism that handed Ferdinand Porsche a medal despite his design visibly losing a turning contest in front of two senior German officials, to the engine that was never once upgraded to match the ever-increasing armor and gun weight Hitler kept personally demanding, was shaped more by one man's personal obsessions than by any coherent, disciplined industrial strategy. Fewer than 1,900 Tigers, combining both the Tiger I and the Tiger II, that's everything Germany built across the entire war, while the Allies built tens of thousands of tanks engineered to a simpler standard, fast enough to replace when lost, simple enough to maintain in the field without specialist factory support, numerous enough to overwhelm a smaller, more sophisticated force through sheer accumulated weight of numbers. Hitler wanted the single best tank in the world, and by several specific measures, gun penetration, frontal armor thickness, the experiences of individual Allied soldiers who encountered one in combat, on a single battlefield, on a given day, with a fully trained crew and a full fuel tank, he may well have gotten exactly that. What this video leaves you with is the same question Heinz Guderian was already quietly asking inside the German High Command in 1942, the same question Albert Speer was still wrestling with years later in his own post-war memoir, and the same question military historians are still actively researching using freshly examined archival records as recently as 2024. What does it actually mean to build the best tank in the world, if the entire system around that obsession means you can only ever afford to build 1,900 of them?